The water pitcher felt weightless in Katie Morrison's hands, the kind of weightless that came from doing the same motion 3,000 times. Refill. Set down. Move. The Friday night crowd at Campanile had that particular kind of loud, the clink of wine glasses, the layered murmur of people who weren't listening to each other, the scrape of expensive cutlery on ceramic. Norfolk's financial district spilled into the restaurant after 5 o'clock, loosening ties and ordering Sauvignon Blancs that cost more than her weekly groceries. She moved through the dining room with the kind of invisible efficiency that came from 17 years of training people to trust her with their lives. No one noticed her. This was intentional. The other servers, Marcus with his practiced charm, Jade with her bright manufactured smile, they worked the room. Katie worked the water. It was cleaner this way. Quieter. The kind of work that let you think about nothing at all, which had been her entire plan for the last 7 years. The fluorescent lights behind the kitchen pass cast everything in a pale clinical glow. Oak Creek Memorial had better lighting than this place, she thought without meaning to think it. She pushed the thought away the same way she'd been pushing thoughts away since she'd traded her dress uniform for a server's apron and a Norfolk address no one would ever connect to Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, combat medic, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 tours through Ramadi where she'd held a field hospital together for 11 hours with nothing but gauze, muscle memory, and the kind of rage that kept you functioning when everything else wanted to break. She was 38 years old. She looked 45 in harsh light and 32 in dim bars. The scars on her hands weren't visible unless you looked closely, thin white lines that mapped a geography of shrapnel, burns, and the one time she'd had to apply a tourniquet to her own leg while waiting for extraction. The tremor came and went. Some days her hands were steady as a surgeon's. Other days they moved like someone learning to be human again after forgetting for a while. The restaurant had 9 tables in her section. 8 were already occupied by 6:30. The 9th, a corner booth with its back to the wall, which Katie had noticed on day 1, remained empty until the older man arrived. She recognized him before she knew why she was recognizing him. Mid-70s, maybe. Weathered in the way that spoke of decades spent outdoors or in deserts or in rooms where the air tasted like copper. His hands trembled as he Saturday. Not the tremor of age, the tremor of someone whose nervous system had been rewired by trauma and never quite recalibrated. She knew that tremor. She lived with that tremor. He was accompanied by a younger man in business casual, carrying a folder and the particular posture of someone about to ask important questions. Son, maybe. Or grandson. The older man's lips were sealed, closed in a way that suggested he'd stopped trying to make them open years ago. Katie approached with the water pitcher, the bread basket, the leather-bound menus. Welcome to Campanile. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you both with something to drink? The older man reached for the menu with hands that couldn't quite hold steady. He pointed at the appetizers section with one trembling finger, then opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Not even air. Just the sound of someone's throat trying to do something it had forgotten how to do. The younger man, a companion, maybe a caregiver, speaking for him, cleared his throat. He'll have the oysters. And we'll need a moment to look at the entrees. Katie was already moving to the next table in her mind, the practiced efficiency that let her work for sections simultaneously without dropping a single glass. But she paused. Something in the older man's eyes. That specific kind of exhaustion that came from the world not working the way it was supposed to. The way his jaw clenched when he couldn't make the words come out. The way he looked at her, really looked at her, for 1 second before dropping his gaze. She'd seen that look in mirrors for 7 years. I'll make sure those oysters are perfect, she said, and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with kitchen technique. And take your time with the menu. The sound of her own voice surprised her sometimes. How soft it had become. How deliberately small. The voice she'd cultivated to make herself disappear into service, into insignificance, into the kind of invisibility that let you move through the world without being asked to be anyone other than a pair of steady hands and a pleasant expression. The older man watched her go. The companion was already opening his folder, sliding papers across the table. Detailed printing. Blue ink. The kind of documentation that meant questions. The kind of questions Katie had learned not to ask anymore. She delivered 3 salads to table 4. Reset napkins at table 6. Checked the kitchen pass where Marco was plating lamb with the kind of precision that made her wonder what he'd done before he became a chef. Maybe she wasn't the only person in Norfolk carrying a previous life like a scar. Maybe the whole world was like this, full of people who used to be someone else, now hiding in plain sight as bartenders and servers and night shift nurses. She was pouring water at table 8 when Derek Hargrove emerged from his office. The restaurant manager wore expensive suits the way other people wore uniforms. Tailored. Armor. His tie cost more than Katie made in 2 days, and his shoes were Italian leather with that particular sheen of someone who'd never worn anything off a shelf. He moved through the dining room like he owned the building, the block, the entire concept of consequence. Maybe he did. He'd been manager here for 3 years, and in that time the restaurant had won a James Beard nomination and doubled its prices. The staff treated him the way people treated weather, something to be managed around, navigated through, survived. He noticed the mute veteran before Katie had even finished her circuit around the room. The sound of his laugh came first, bright and theatrical in a way that made heads turn. "Oh, this should be interesting," he said to no one in particular, loudly enough for the dining room to hear. He was already moving toward the corner booth, the folder, the trembling hands. Katie's shoulders tensed. Not visibly. Just that small internal tightening that was all the warning her body needed to tell her something was about to be terrible. Hargrove stood at the edge of their table, jacket crisp as a knife blade. His smile had that quality of something sharp beneath it. "So we have a communication situation," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the dining room. Several diners were watching now. This was free entertainment. "Gentlemen, I'm Derek Hargrove, the manager here. I just want to make sure we can accommodate your needs. Or, he paused, his smile widening, your lack of needs." The companion stiffened. The older man's jaw clenched tighter. Katie felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear. The tremor wasn't fear anymore. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. The way you recognize your own name before anyone has said it. She set down her water pitcher on the nearest empty table and didn't look away. Hargrove was still talking, his words falling like something poisonous into the quiet. "What's the matter, my friend? The cat got your—" He stopped himself, manufactured a laugh that sounded like gravel in a disposal. "Well, you know how that one goes." 3 tables had stopped eating. One couple was filming on their phones. And Katie Morrison, 7-year veteran of invisibility, moved toward the corner booth with her water pitcher and the kind of steady presence that made the air pressure change. The booth in the corner of Campanile occupied the most visible real estate in the restaurant. The Friday night crowd had swelled to 97 people according to the reservation book Katie had checked that afternoon. The man in the corner booth wore a faded VA baseball cap. His hands moved when he tried to speak, fingers painting shapes in the air the way people do when words won't come. Next to him sat a woman in her 50s, probably his daughter, her jaw tight as she listened to him struggle through his order. Derek Hargrove materialized at the table like a shark sensing blood in the water. He was 42, carried himself like a man who'd never heard the word no, and wore a $3,000 suit that hung on his frame the way expensive things do on people who mistake money for dignity. His eyes had that particular glint that comes from knowing the power differential in a room and enjoying it. "You know, sir," Hargrove said, his voice pitched loud enough to carry across the dining room, "we have a picture menu. You could just point." Katie watched from the service station near the kitchen. Her hands continued moving, rolling silverware, restocking water glasses, but her attention had narrowed to a single point. The man's hand stopped moving. His daughter's face flushed. Hargrove wasn't done. He never was. He began imitating the veteran's gestures, exaggerating the hand movements into something grotesque, something childish. His fingers fluttered in mock confusion while the people at the nearest tables began to smile, uncertain whether to laugh. One couple did laugh, sharp, bright sounds that hung in the air like poison. Hargrove grinned wider. Maybe the VA should teach hand signals before they let these guys out in public, he announced, pitching his voice to Carrie. Save everyone the hassle. The woman across from him, his daughter, definitely, stood up. That's enough. But Hargrove was already turning away, already catching sight of the notebook in her hands, the one where she'd been writing down details. Prices. Charges. The exact dollar amounts on the bill. His expression changed. The mockery shifted into something colder, something tactical. Katie had seen this before, not in restaurants, but in forward operating bases when someone realized you'd caught them stealing supplies meant for field hospitals. The daughter was speaking now, her voice steady but angry. I want to know why you charged military pricing for 2 appetizers but full price for the main course. I've called 5 other restaurants and none of them have this structure. This looks like... Like what? Hargrove cut her off, his tone turning smooth as oil. Like good business? Like we support our veterans? Because we do. Very much. Your father is getting a generous discount, and frankly, we don't appreciate the implication. Katie set down her water pitcher. She didn't remember deciding to move. Muscle memory took over, not the kind from nursing school, but the older kind, the kind that came from 11 hours in a concrete room with rounds coming through the walls and no backup coming for another 70 minutes. She walked to their table with that measured pace, the one that made new residents at Oak Creek Memorial ask why she never hurried, even during codes. She placed one hand on the veteran's shoulder. His skin felt thin beneath her palm, fragile as paper. She looked directly at Hargrove, and when she spoke, her voice dropped into a register it hadn't occupied in 7 years. The only disability in this room is your humanity. And I don't think there's a cure for that. The silence that followed was the kind you could operate in. Hargrove's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then his hand came up, not to her face, not quite, but to the water pitcher on a nearby table. He knocked it clean over the edge. Water crashed to tile. The pitcher clattered. It splashed across Katie's uniform, soaking the right side of her scrubs from collarbone to hip, and when she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the sudden cold, Hargrove jabbed his finger toward the kitchen with the viciousness of a man who'd just realized his leverage was evaporating. Pick that up, he said, his voice low and venomous, or pick up your final paycheck. Your choice, sweetheart. Katie knelt to clean the spill. The broken pitcher lay in fragments. Water spread across the tile in fingers that reached toward the bar. Around her, the restaurant had gone dead silent. No clinking glasses. No murmured conversations. Just the sound of her hands gathering ceramic shards, steady and methodical, while every eye in Campanile bore down on the spot where she knelt. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She didn't speak. But as she gathered the pieces into a neat stack, her fingers moved across one shard, and beneath her uniform, the faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, the one from 160th Saw Night Stalkers, the one she'd hidden away 7 years ago when she walked out of the flight line for the last time, seemed to press against her ribs like it was trying to break through. She was still on her knees when the paramedics arrived at 11:38 p.m. The call came over the radio in the kitchen first. A regular customer, a man in his 70s with COPD and a history of cardiac problems, had been eating at the bar and suddenly clutched his chest. The bartender called 911 before anyone else could react. By the time Katie heard the intercom code, she was already moving, not toward the front of the house, but toward the employee lockers. She shouldn't have. Protocol meant staying in the dining room. The manager was already there. The owner was already there. But Katie's hands were pulling on gloves anyway, and her eyes were assessing the situation with a precision that belonged to someone who'd made split-second triage decisions while mortars walked toward her position. The veteran was down. His lips had gone bluish. His daughter was screaming for someone to call an ambulance. The bartender was performing chest compressions with the wild panic of someone who'd learned CPR years ago and prayed never to use it. Katie could see the problem in less than 3 seconds. The veins in his neck were distended like ropes. His heart sounds were muffled. The way his chest moved against each compression was wrong, like pushing on a balloon that was too full. Cardiac tamponade. Blood pooling around the heart, compressing it, stopping it from beating. Without drainage, he had maybe 5 minutes. Katie knelt beside him. Stop compressions. Now. The bartender looked at her. Hargrove looked at her. Several diners stood up from their tables, phones already in their hands. I need a ballpoint pen, Katie said, and her voice had changed again. It wasn't the quiet voice of a server anymore. It was command. It was the voice of someone used to being obeyed in situations where seconds determined whether people lived or died. The sharpest knife from the kitchen. A lighter. Get them now. Someone moved. Someone called 911 again, reporting a nurse on scene. Katie had already torn open the man's shirt, already found the landmarks, 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line, already located the spot where the needle needed to go. The bartender returned with a serrated knife and a ballpoint pen. Someone else had a lighter from the bar. Katie sterilized the needle tip in the lighter flame. The smell of burning plastic mixed with the copper and salt smell of blood. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at Hargrove watching from across the restaurant. She placed the needle exactly where it needed to go, felt the slight give of tissue, and heard that sound, the hiss of air escaping. Pressurized air hissing out of the pericardial sac. Immediately, the man's lips began to pink. His breathing eased. The bluish tint started to fade. She kept her hand steady. Pressure. Steady pressure. The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive. Behind her, Hargrove was already on his phone. She could hear him, his voice tight, controlled, calling the restaurant owner with a story about an unqualified waitress performing illegal medical procedures. Calling the chief administrator at Norfolk City Health Department. Laying groundwork. Building his case. Activating his network like a man who understood that the best defense was a good offense. That perception moved faster than truth, that if he could frame this as reckless endangerment instead of life-saving, he might survive it. By the time the ambulance arrived, ETA confirmed at 11:53 p.m., Katie had already known what was coming. The paramedics took over, lifted the man onto a stretcher, and one of them, a woman in her 50s with sergeant major bearing, put a hand on Katie's shoulder. "What you did probably saved his life," she said. Katie didn't respond. She was watching Hargrove across the restaurant, watching him watch her, watching him already composing his narrative. The network he could activate. The board members he knew. The inspectors he'd had dinner with. The reputation he could damage before she even realized the knife had gone in. She had no idea that the man on the stretcher would remember her face. No idea that he'd already recognized something in the precise way she moved, the way she issued commands, the clinical detachment with which she'd saved his life at 11:52 p.m. on a Friday night in a restaurant. He would remember because 7 years ago, in a concrete room in Ramadi with rounds coming through the walls, she'd done almost exactly this with equipment that was actually designed for the job instead of a ballpoint pen and desperation. But that wasn't the worst part. The old man's hand found his chest first. Not a slow reach, a clutch. Fingers splayed across his sternum like he was trying to hold something in, something crucial leaking out into the spaces between his ribs. His mouth opened. No sound came. Just that terrible silent gasp, the kind that meant the body was drowning in its own fluid while the lungs screamed for air that would never reach the cells. Katie saw it before anyone else did. She was 3 tables away, pitcher still in her left hand, and the shift in his posture registered like a triage alert, the chin dropping, the eyes going wide, that specific color drain that meant the heart wasn't pumping anymore, just stuttering. She set the water pitcher down on the nearest table without breaking stride. Her body was already moving before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory routing her toward crisis the way a bird finds magnetic north. Hargrove didn't notice. He was laughing with a couple at the bar, drink in hand, his expensive suit catching the restaurant's amber lighting like he was the host of his own show. The room had that Friday night density, 62 people by the window count Katie had made at 7:43, but sound travels different when someone's in real trouble. It compresses. It gets strange. The veteran's companion stood up first. A woman, his daughter, probably, mid-50s, grey threading through dark hair, and her voice came out sharp. "Dad? Dad, are you okay?" Katie was beside them before the question finished echoing. She moved like water finding its level, no panic in her hands, no haste that looked like fear. She knelt, one motion, and her eyes found his pupils. Blown. Both of them. His skin had taken on that waxy appearance, pale with a faint blue undertone around the lips and earlobes, peripheral cyanosis, not the good kind, not the kind you fixed with oxygen alone. His neck veins were distended like blue cords running up the sides of his throat, and when she pressed 2 fingers against his sternum, she felt the muffled thud, one beat, then nothing clear, then a weird diminished second sound like he was drowning in his own chest cavity. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid around the heart. The pressure building, the ventricles being crushed by their own pericardium filling with blood. For minutes. Maybe 5. She'd seen it in a hospital in Ramadi with incoming mortars and exactly 0 surgical instruments except what you could improvise. "Call 911, she said. Not a request. The voice had changed. Dropped an octave. Carried the weight of every choice she'd made in the dark. "And I need a ballpoint pen. The sharpest knife from the kitchen. A lighter." Someone's phone was already out. The daughter was staring at her, some mix of confusion and desperate hope on her face. Who was this woman who'd appeared like the room had summoned her? Hargrove had turned from the bar, his expression shifting from amusement to something harder, protective of his establishment's emergency like it was a threat to his reputation. "What are you doing?" His voice cut across the restaurant's sudden silence. "You can't just, we have a protocol. We need to call." "The paramedics are 4 minutes out," Katie said. Without looking at him. Her hands were already under the veteran's shirt, feeling for the landmarks. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomical road map was still there, drawn in her muscle memory from a field hospital where she'd done this with a needle driver and pure stubborn refusal to let a good man die because the standard surgical equipment was 50 miles away. He doesn't have 4 minutes. A server, young kid, maybe 22, appeared with a knife. Not the sharpest, but the blade was clean. Katie held it up to the lighter someone had found, watching the heat dance across the metal. Heat was sterilization when it was all you had. She remembered this. The feeling. The particular kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. She held the knife point against the lighter flame for 6 seconds. The metal glowed. The smell of heat and carbon filled the small space around them, something chemical and sharp. Pain was information. Pain was data. She would cauterize as she went. Minimize bleeding. Keep him oxygenating. The pen came next, a big ballpoint, blue ink, plastic barrel about the diameter of an airway. She took it apart with 2 quick moves, hand steady as the surgical lights in Ramadi had been when she was the only one standing between a Marine and bleeding out on a concrete floor. The ink tube came free. The empty barrel was her needle now, a makeshift catheter, an improvised decompression needle that would let the pressure out of his chest and let his heart beat again. The daughter gripped her hand. "What's happening? What are you?" "His heart is being crushed," Katie said. Not unkind. Just precise. "I'm going to let the fluid out." She cleaned the second intercostal space with her sleeve, not ideal, not sterile, but good enough, and positioned the knife point at the intersection of anatomical landmarks. Her hands did not shake. They never had. Not in the field. Not in the rain. Not in the moment when everything depended on not shaking. She cut. Deep enough to reach the pleural space, shallow enough to avoid the lung. The skin parted. blood welled dark against his pale chest. She traded the knife for the pen barrel and positioned it with both hands, a surgeon's precision using a Bic ballpoint and determination, and she drove it through the pericardium in one smooth motion. The sound was a hiss. Not metaphorical. An actual hiss of air and pressure releasing, the sound of his chest cavity decompressing, of the life-crushing weight lifting. Dark fluid rushed out, blood from a vessel that had torn inside his chest, accumulated under pressure, suffocating his heart. Katie maintained pressure with one hand while she felt for his pulse with the other. Thready. Fast. Panicking. But there. Get me gauze or cloth, she said. Anything clean. Hargrove was still frozen by the bar. Other diners had their phones out, recording, or standing with hands over their mouths, uncertain whether they were watching a miracle or a crime. The daughter was crying silently, watching this stranger work on her father with the kind of concentrated focus that only comes from years of doing it when the stakes were measured in lives instead of lawsuits. Katie packed the wound with napkin someone brought, not ideal, but the bleeding was slowing. She placed her fingers on his carotid artery. Pulse was there. Weaker than it should be, but present. Sustained. The color was coming back to his face, that terrible waxy pallor fading as his heart resumed something closer to its normal rhythm. Pulse is there, she said. Not to anyone in particular. Just stating the data. Breathing? The daughter checked. Yes. Yes, he's breathing. Katie kept one hand on the wound, maintained pressure, watched his chest rise and fall. The restaurant had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the distant wail of an ambulance maybe 2 blocks out, getting closer. Getting here. Getting to them. O2 sat. A man's voice from somewhere in the crowd, maybe a doctor, maybe just someone with medical training from decades ago. Katie didn't answer directly. She was counting. Watching his color. Waiting for the ambulance. The veteran's eyes were open now, tracking, terrified but present. Alive. She looked at him, let her face be steady, let him see that the panic could end. You're going to be okay, she said. Paramedics are here in 60 seconds. You're going to the hospital. You're going to live. The old man's lips moved. No sound came, the same inability to speak that had made him vulnerable to Hargrove's cruelty an hour ago. But his eyes found hers. And something happened in that moment. A shift. A recognition that passed between them like a current. Like he was trying to say something he couldn't speak. Like the way she'd moved, the things she knew, the authority in her voice, it meant something to him. The doors burst open. Paramedics flooded in with a stretcher and the particular controlled chaos of people who did this every shift. Katie gave them the handoff in the language they understood, cardiac tamponade. Pericardiocentesis performed approximately 90 seconds ago using needle decompression. Vitals stabilized. Pulse 118, respiration 16, color improving. No known allergies, unknown medical history beyond current presentation. They didn't ask who she was. They didn't need to. They loaded him and they left, lights painting the restaurant red and blue, sirens fading down the Norfolk street. The door closed. The restaurant exhaled. Katie stood alone in the space where she'd just performed battlefield surgery in the middle of a Friday night dinner service. Her scrubs were spotted with blood. Her hands smelled like antiseptic and the copper of plasma. The other diners were still silent, still holding their phones, still uncertain whether they'd witnessed a crime or a salvation. What they didn't know was that in exactly 72 minutes, Dr. Hargrove would be on a phone call with the restaurant owner and 2 city council members he'd paid for influence over the past 4 years, spinning the story into something different: reckless endangerment by an unqualified employee, liability exposure, the need for immediate disciplinary action. What they didn't know was that Katie Morrison's quiet authority had just signed her termination papers in blood and desperation, and the kind of skill that only came from having already done this when everything was burning around her. But the veteran in the ambulance knew. Somehow, he knew. The paramedics arrived in waves, their movements precise and practiced, and the lead technician, a woman with sergeant stripes on her sleeve, pulled Katie aside while her partner loaded the veteran into the ambulance. "What you did," the sergeant said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen field medicine before, "that was textbook emergency pericardiocentesis. You saved his life." The second paramedic nodded, checking his watch, 11:36 p.m. "Hospital's 6 minutes out. Vitals are stable because of you." Katie said nothing. She never did except praise the way civilians expected it. She simply watched the ambulance doors close and the lights pull away into the Norfolk night, and that small acknowledgement that someone had seen what she'd done and understood it settled something in her chest that had been fractured for 7 years. The back doors of Campanile burst open before the ambulance had even turned the corner. Derek Hargrove stood silhouetted against the kitchen lights, his face a shade of red that suggested his phone calls had not gone according to plan. Beside him was the restaurant owner, Marcus Chen, a thin man with the exhausted expression of someone who'd just been informed his business was about to become a liability. Behind them walked a lawyer, expensive suit, leather briefcase, the kind of professional who materialized when lawsuits were being drafted. The lawyer's shoes clicked against the tile with each step, each click a small warning bell. "We need to talk," Hargrove said, his voice stripped of the casual cruelty it had carried minutes earlier. Now it carried something sharper. Something legal. Katie was still in her soiled uniform, the water stain spreading across her left shoulder like a map of tonight's humiliation. She set down the picture she'd been holding and met his eyes with the kind of stillness that had once made junior soldiers straighten their spines. One measured breath. Then she waited. "You performed an unauthorized medical procedure," the lawyer began, his words arriving like bullets from a practiced gun. "Without consent. Without proper credentials on file. Without hospital authorization. You are not licensed as a physician. You are not credentialed for invasive procedures." Each sentence landed exactly where it was meant to land. The dining room had gone quiet. Every eye was on the small tableau by the kitchen doors. "What you did constitutes practicing medicine without a license and creates significant liability for this establishment." "He was in cardiac tamponade," Katie said. Her voice was steady. A single sentence. That was all the dignity she would allow herself. "He would have died in 4 minutes. That is irrelevant to the legal standing," the lawyer continued, as though she had not spoken. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. You are banned from these premises. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement before you leave, and you will not discuss tonight's events with any staff member or media outlet." Marcus Chen looked at his shoes. He would not meet her eyes. That told her everything about how those phone calls had gone, how Hargrove had explained to the owner that keeping Katie on staff was far more expensive than losing a server, how a lawsuit would cost more than 7 years of her wages, how the military community was small and litigious and very, very protective of its reputation. "I want you to understand something," Hargrove said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into the range that only Katie and the lawyer could hear. The tremor in it was not anger. It was fear. "You overstepped. You inserted yourself into a situation where you had no authority. You made a choice that was not yours to make, and now my business faces 6 figures in potential liability because of your heroics." Katie did not respond. She simply turned and walked toward the employee break room, where her jacket hung on a peg and her spare shoe sat in a locker. The lawyer followed, watching as she emptied the small metal compartment. Her jacket. Her keys. A paperback novel she'd been reading for 3 weeks. A container of yogurt that had expired on Tuesday. Everything that made up her presence here, all of it fitting into a plastic bag that one of the line cooks handed her without being asked. The unit patch was still sewn inside the jacket lining, hidden where no casual observer would find it. 7 inches of faded fabric bearing the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Command, her old unit, the place where she had been someone else, someone whose name carried weight and whose hands had saved 847 lives across 3 tours in places that did not appear on most maps. She had sewn it there 7 years ago, the night before she left. A reminder. A promise to herself that she would never go back. She did not check to make sure it was still there. She knew it was. The back exit was 40 feet from the break room, and no one attempted to stop her. Hargrove had already returned to the private dining room to contact his board members. Marcus Chen was on his phone with his insurance company. The lawyer was drafting the non-disclosure agreement that Katie would not sign because she would never return to this restaurant, and they both knew it. The servers and kitchen staff watched her pass, their expressions caught somewhere between sympathy and fear that they might be next, that their own invisible histories might suddenly become liabilities. The parking lot was empty except for her car, a 2011 Honda Civic that had carried her through 6 different states and 4 different identities. The rain had started again, light and intermittent, the kind of Norfolk rain that fell in spurts like a broken faucet. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open and the plastic bag on her lap and did not move for exactly 3 minutes. Then she drove to Oak Creek Memorial Hospital. She had been avoiding it for 406 days. She knew the exact number because she had counted. After the 3rd panic attack in the parking garage, she had decided that going to her own appointments would be worse than not going, that sitting in a waiting room with other veterans, men and women who carried the same weight she carried, would require a level of vulnerability she had not managed to find in 7 years. It was easier to work double shifts at the restaurant. It was easier to fill the silence with the rhythms of service, refilling water glasses, reciting specials, pretending that she was just a server, just a woman, just someone trying to live a quiet life in a quiet city. The automatic doors of Oak Creek Memorial slid open at 12:19 a.m., and Katie Morrison walked through them not as Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, not as the woman who had performed emergency surgery with a ballpoint pen and a lighter in a restaurant dining room, not as the decorated combat medic who had held a field hospital alone under enemy fire in Ramadi. She walked through as no one. Just another name in the system. Just another veteran in a waiting room. The VA clinic had emergency hours. A veteran never had to wait for a crisis. She approached the desk, and the receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and a nameplate that read Susan, looked up from her paperwork. Name: Katie Morrison. Susan typed something into her computer, and Katie watched the woman's expression shift slightly. A pause. A small frown. We have you in the system, Ms. Morrison. You were last seen 406 days ago for your initial intake. Your provider has been trying to reach you. I'm here now, Katie said. The waiting room held 14 other people. A man with a prosthetic leg scrolled through his phone. A woman with gray hair sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. 3 younger men in baseball caps sat clustered near the window, speaking in low voices about something that made them laugh in the sudden, unexpected way that only veterans could laugh, the kind that cut through despair for just a moment before letting it settle back down. Katie sat in an empty chair and became part of the waiting room. Invisible. Anonymous. One more person carrying weight that no one else could see. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The next morning, sunlight carved through the restaurant windows like a surgical blade, and Katie was not there to see it. She sat in her apartment in Norfolk, 3 miles from Campanile, and wrapped around a coffee mug she hadn't drunk from in 20 minutes. The apartment was sparse, a mattress on a floor, 2 kitchen chairs, a single framed photograph face down on the nightstand. She'd been staring at her phone since 5:22 a.m., watching the cursor blink on an email she couldn't finish writing to the VA hospital. Her hands felt like they belonged to someone else. Numb. Distant. A medic's hands that had saved lives in sandstorms, now too broken to schedule her own appointment. The doorbell made her flinch. She didn't move. The bell rang again. Then a 3rd time, longer. Katie set the mug down with deliberate care and walked to the door without checking the peephole. Through the glass, she saw him first, the old man from the restaurant, moving with purpose now, color returned to his lips. Behind him stood his daughter, her eyes red from crying. And then the uniforms. 2 of them. Senior Chief Petty Officer rank on both collars, dress blues pressed sharp enough to cut, ribbons on their chests arranged like a constellation of things that mattered. Katie's stomach dropped into free fall. She didn't open the door yet. The daughter pressed the bell again, and the old man reached forward, his hand trembling as he held up his phone. The text-to-speech voice was mechanical, devoid of the humanity behind it, but the single word it spoke made Katie's knees lock. Reaper. Her call sign. The name no one had spoken aloud in 7 years. The name she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it belonged to a different person in a different lifetime. Katie opened the door. The daughter moved first, stepping inside without waiting for invitation. "Your Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison," she said, voice shaking. "You saved my father in Ramadi 7 years ago. You held a field hospital alone while the city burned around you. He talks about you every single day. He can't speak, but he writes your name down like a prayer." The old man nodded, tears streaming now, and Katie saw it then, the scar tissue on his neck, the way he held his right arm slightly rigid. Shrapnel. IED. She had treated him during the siege of Jolan district, had stitched him back together while artillery cracked overhead and the smell of burning diesel filled the air. She had told him his name was Reaper because she didn't want to die alone and she needed something to hold on to that wasn't her own fear. The first SEAL stepped forward, tablet in hand, and began reading in a voice that carried the weight of official record. 3 bronze stars. Katie heard the words, but they felt like they were happening to someone behind glass. 2nd bronze in Ramadi for coordinated medical response under sustained hostile fire. The room seemed to compress around her. 2nd bronze for leadership during the siege of Marja. 3rd bronze for training 23 Afghan medics in stabilization protocols. The SEAL paused, let each decoration settle. 2 purple hearts. 1 for shrapnel wounds sustained during the convoy IED in Logar province. 1 for blast trauma during the mortar strike on FOB Shank. He turned the tablet slightly. And the Navy Cross. His voice dropped an octave. For action in Ramadi, Jolan district, where you held a field hospital alone for 11 hours under sustained enemy fire. You refused evacuation. You treated 42 soldiers that day. 38 of them walked out. The SEAL looked directly at her. The other 4 made it to surgical at Al-Assad. They lived because of you. Katie didn't feel her legs move, but suddenly she was sitting on one of the kitchen chairs. The old man's daughter sat across from her, holding her father's hand. At that exact moment, across the city, Derek Hargrove was opening the restaurant for the morning shift when the doors burst open. The 2 SEALs walked in first, badges already visible. Behind them came a woman in a charcoal suit, FBI credentials catching the light. Behind her came 3 more uniforms. The room went so quiet you could hear the espresso machine cooling down in the kitchen. Hargrove's face drained of all color. He took 3 steps backward, his foot catching on a chair leg. The FBI agent walked directly to the host stand. "Derek Hargrove? I'm Special Agent Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have some questions about your financial practices regarding the military discount program between January 2017 and present date. We'll need your records, your personal banking statements, and a list of every call you made to board members, city council representatives, and hospital administrators regarding Katie Morrison." She pulled a folder from her briefcase. "We've already reviewed the security footage from last night. We have everything. What we don't have is your cooperation, and that makes this harder on everyone." Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "I don't know what you're talking about. That nurse performed an illegal medical procedure on private property. I was protecting my business. There's nothing wrong with billing active duty personnel double the military discount rate and pocketing the difference." Agent Chen flipped a page. "With calling 3 city councilmen to falsify employment records? With instructing your staff to document disciplinary violations that never happened?" She stepped closer. "With deliberately humiliating that veteran to intimidate him into leaving because his companion was asking about your accounting." The agent's voice remained level, surgical. "That's wire fraud, Mr. Hargrove. That's conspiracy. That's elder abuse of a disabled person. That's defamation of character. And that's before we talk about the calls you made to Oak Creek Memorial's hospital board trying to have Ms. Morrison's nursing license revoked. Hargrove's hands began to shake. He reached for the bar behind him. "Don't touch anything," Agent Chen said quietly. The restaurant manager's breathing accelerated. A vein in his temple began to pulse. He looked around at his staff, the morning crew he'd been training for 6 years, the dishwashers and line cooks who'd watched him mock that mute veteran with the kind of casual cruelty that only power allows. Every single one of them was staring at him with something that looked like recognition. Like they were seeing him clearly for the first time. "This is harassment," Hargrove spat, his voice cracking. "I'm a veteran too, I served my country, and I don't have to stand here and listen to." "You served 8 weeks in the National Guard in 2003, Agent Chen interrupted, not looking up from her folder. "You were discharged after falsifying expense reports for a private military contract in Iraq. You never saw combat. You never treated a single wound. And you just deliberately humiliated a man who lost the ability to speak because of IED shrapnel while saving your life in Ramadi." She closed the folder with a soft click. "So no, Mr. Hargrove. You don't get to invoke service you dishonored." That was when the security guard walked in. The same man who'd watched Katie carry out her personal possessions in a plastic bag the night before. He was holding a cardboard box. He walked directly to Hargrove and set it down on the nearest table with the kind of deliberate slowness that meant something. Inside were photographs, the ledgers, the falsified timesheets, the text messages between Hargrove and City Council members discussing solutions to the Katie Morrison problem. "Mr. Hargrove," the guard said, his voice carrying no anger, which somehow made it worse, "I believe you know the way out. The owners decided the military discount program needs someone with actual integrity running it. That's not going to be you." Hargrove's face went from pale to crimson. He looked like he was about to say something, and then the officer to Agent Chen's right stepped forward, and Hargrove saw the name tape on his uniform. It read Commander Holloway, and underneath it, a tattoo visible on his neck, a seal trident. The same tattoo Katie had seen on the forearms of men who'd brought her into Ramadi 7 years ago. The same tattoo worn by people who remembered everything. Commander Holloway didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Hargrove's leg seemed to give out slightly, and one of the uniformed officers moved to stand beside him. Not touching him. Just present. The implication was clear. 6 months later, Katie sat in the trauma conference room at Oak Creek Memorial, but this time she was standing at the front of the room, teaching. A dozen medical students surrounded her, and she was walking them through the procedures she performed in sandstorms, now refined by years of civilian emergency medicine. She'd been offered the position of Director of Trauma Services 3 weeks earlier. She'd declined and asked to continue her shifts in the ER instead. The hospital board had suggested she at least teach 1 course per quarter. She'd agreed to that. "The key to pericardiocentesis in a tamponade scenario," she was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done this before it had a name, "is understanding that every second without fluid removal is a second closer to arrest. You don't have time for perfect. You have time for functional." Her hands moved through the motions without hesitation. "You're looking for that sudden release of resistance when the needle enters the pericardial sac. That's your signal that you're in the right place. Trust your tactile feedback. Trust what your hands know." One of the students raised his hand. "Were you military, You speak like someone who's done this under fire." Katie set the model down. "Once upon a time," she said quietly. "Now I'm here. And that's where my fight is." That evening, driving home through Norfolk, Katie passed the community college on Route 64. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a route home that avoided the restaurant, when movement in one of the ground floor windows caught her eye. She slowed the car, pulled into the lot, and walked to the window. Through the glass, she could see a classroom. Inside, a man in a polo shirt with a community college logo was demonstrating CPR compressions on a mannequin. His movements were stiff and confident. A student raised her hand with a question and he flinched as if she'd moved too quickly. His face was thinner than she remembered, lined in new ways. When he turned to write on the whiteboard, she could see his name tag, Steve, CPR instructor. Derek Hargrove, who'd been charged with wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy, who'd taken a plea deal that included permanent surrender of his restaurant operating license and 5 years of probation, was teaching basic CPR for minimum wage to people who would never know who he'd been. The suit was gone. The network was gone. The ability to make calls that destroyed lives was gone. Katie stood at the window for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked back to her car. The waiting room at Oak Creek Memorial now had a new wing, the Veterans Crisis Center, funded by a settlement and federal grant. Katie helped establish the protocols there, trained the staff, and made sure every protocol started with listening. With dignity. With the understanding that the quietest person in the room had often survived the loudest hell. One afternoon, a young corpsman, fresh out of active duty, and still shaking from things he couldn't articulate, sat across from her during a peer-led group session. Midway through the conversation, he looked at her and asked, "How did you get through it? How do you live after you've seen what we've seen?" Katie considered the question. "You find people worth staying present for," she said. "And sometimes you find that you yourself are worth staying present for. That took me longer than it should have." She paused. "You don't have to be whole to be strong. You just have to choose to stay." The corpsman nodded slowly. Later that week, the barista at the coffee shop near the hospital, the one Katie visited every Tuesday at 6:13 a.m., was working the counter when Katie came in. He was in his early 50s, salt and pepper beard, eyes that looked like they'd seen things. He wrote her usual order on the cup without asking, and when he handed it to her, he'd written a phone number below her name. "If you ever want to talk to someone who understands why you drink the same coffee every single day like it's a ritual," he'd written, "call me. I'm here most mornings." Katie looked at the cup for a long moment, then at his face. There was no expectation in his expression. Just an offer. A door left open. She smiled, the first real smile in months that didn't cost her anything, and tucked the cup into her bag. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The choice to keep moving forward even when every part of her wanted to dissolve into the weight of what she'd survived. The choice to stay visible, to be counted, to let people see her. Scars tell stories. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people read them. So here's what I want to ask you: if you saw quiet strength standing next to you, in your workplace, in your community, in your family, would you recognize it? And if you saw corruption thriving in the spaces where trust should live, what would you do? Because sometimes accountability doesn't require a badge or a gun. Sometimes it just requires one person willing to say no. The question is, will you be that person? Like and subscribe if you appreciate hardworking people who don't get the credit they deserve. Comment and tell us what you did for a living, or what you do now. Let's get into it.